has been a visceral pain, a community trying to understand who we are and where we go from here. I'm joined today by Attorney General Ellison, by Major General John Jensen, the Adjutant General of the Minnesota National Guard, Colonel Langer of the Minnesota State Patrol, and Commissioner John Harrington. I spoke this morning with Reverend Jackson, who, much like Valerie, said a prayer for our state, said a prayer for over those grieving, said a prayer for peace, and then also said something very important. This is the moment where we start, but every time we get to this place, we never start the process to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that commitment amongst leaders in our community, watching this happen across the United States, watching another name be added, and for those of us who are old enough, to Rodney King, to Mike Brown, and unfortunately now we've added George Floyd. The situation on the ground doesn't allow us at this time to tackle those issues. The very assets in our community, our libraries, our businesses, those nonprofits and government entities, our light rail system, are all shut down from this. We have to restore order to our society before we can start addressing the issues, before we turn back to where we should be spending our energy, making sure that justice is served swiftly, and that we learn something from what George Floyd gave on Monday. Now, I want to just be very clear, and I'm going to have the team talk about what transitioned last night when the state assumed responsibility over the security near the 3rd precinct, where the state secured critical assets, and where the plan going forward to ensure that tonight our buildings do not burn, our citizens are secure, and that space that we're going to create allows us to get back to the conversation of serving justice and making sure that we're not adding to that list of unheard names. And I want to be very clear and speak to that community. The very tools that we need to use to get control, to make sure that buildings aren't burned and the rule of law collapses, are those very institutional tools that have led to that grief and pain. I understand clearly there is no trust in many of our communities. And the differentiation between the Minneapolis Police Department that we witnessed losing trust of those they're there to serve is very difficult for people to make for those standing up here with me. I understand that. And I will not patronize you as a white man without living those lived experiences of how very difficult that is. But I'm asking you to help us. Help us use humane way to get the streets to a place where we can restore the justice so that those that are expressing rage and anger and demanding justice are heard, not those who throw firebombs into businesses that our communities of colors have worked so hard to build back up areas that were blighted at one time and are thriving because of their entrepreneurship and their hard work. A library in an area where our children, as we know, are institutionally put behind, and the achievement gap for our communities of color is a shame on this state that we continue to admire by talking about and don't repair it. And that tool to help with that burned last night. So I want to just call out very, very clearly, as we put a presence on the street to restore order, it is to open that space to seek justice and heal what happened. I will not in any way not acknowledge that there's going to be that pain, but my first and foremost responsibility to the state of Minnesota is the safety and security of all citizens. We cannot have the looting and the recklessness that went on. We cannot have it because we can't function as a society, and I refuse to have it take away the attention of the stain that we need to be working on is what happened with those fundamental institutional racism that allows a man to be held down in broad daylight, and thank God a young person had a camera to video it, because there's not a person here or listening today that wonders how many times that camera's not there. These are tough questions. These are things that have been brewing in this country for 400 years. We have people out there putting themselves on the line to try and put out fires in our firefighters that are under attack. Those are the things I'm asking you. Help me restore that order. We will do that under state leadership and state guidance. You will hear directly from them of once that decision was made around 12:15 last night, and that first mission was executed around 3:45 at the 3rd precinct, we will see a difference. So I'm asking you, and you'll hear from them, to talk about this. I also want to think about what happens when we don't have that. People who are concerned about that police presence of an overly armed camp in their neighborhoods that is not seen in communities where children of people who look like me run to the police, others have to run from. So I understand that that's out there. But last night I got a call from a friend and a dedicated public servant. Senator Torres Ray called in her district, and it was on fire. And there weren't any police there. There weren't any firefighters. There was no social control, and her constituents were locked in their house wondering what they were going to do. That is an abject failure that cannot happen. We must restore that order to that. Senator Torres Ray has fought her whole life on these issues of inequities and making sure that people's voices are lifted up. But what she understands is none of us can lift those voices. None of us can tackle these problems if anarchy reigns on the street. I also want to address an issue, and this one is on me, and I will own it. Earlier this morning, when this mission was carried out under my direction to resecure the 3rd precinct, to do so in a manner which I am proud of how it was executed by this team, no injuries and no loss of life, a reestablishment to put the fires out for those businesses. A CNN reporter a crew was arrested by the State Patrol. A few minutes after hearing that, I was on a call with CNN President Jeff Zucker, who demanded to know what happened. I take full responsibility. There is absolutely no reason something like this should happen. Calls were made immediately. This is a very public apology to that team. It should not happen. And I want to be clear for those of you listening. I think our Minnesota's reporters know this. I am a teacher by trade, and I have spent my time as governor highlighting the need to be as transparent as possible and have the press here. I failed you last night in that. And it does not escape me that we are here on the catalyst that lit this spark by what happened with a police detainment of George Floyd, and the idea that a reporter would have been taken while another police action was in play is inexcusable. So to CNN, to the CNN team, to the journalists here, this is about having a plan, and that's what these folks are going to talk about. This is about having an aggressive approach to understanding what the community needs, to not coming in heavy-handed with them, but to create space where the story can be told. In a situation like this, even if you're clearing an area, we have got to ensure that there is a safe spot for journalism to tell the story. The issue here is trust. The community that's down there that's terrorized by this, if they see a reporter being arrested, their assumption is because something's going to happen that they don't want to be seen. And so that is unacceptable. We will continue to strive to make sure that that accessibility is maintained, that not only that, the protection and security and safety of the journalists covering this is a top priority, not because it's a nice thing to do, because it is a key component of how we fix this. Sunshine, disinfectant, and seeing what's happening has to be done. So again, I appreciate President Zucker's call. I appreciate his understanding in a situation that he was rightfully incredibly angry, and that falls squarely on me. That apology has been issued, and I think going forward to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's time for us to clean our streets. It's time for us to execute today in a way that shows respect and dignity to communities. I'm going to ask for a lot of help today of those folks who want to see it. It is my expectation that justice for the officers involved in this will be swift, that it will come in a timely manner, that it will be fair. That is what we've asked for. I have been in contact with Hennepin County Attorney, and I am confident that those very things I just said will happen. We will continue at the BCA to do a fair, a full, and a swift gathering of all of the evidence involved. But I would reiterate again, for so many of us, not all that's done in every other case where all of that evidence is gathered before, and I would ask that the swift justice be carried out. So Minnesotans, your pain is real. The chapter that's been written this week is one of our darkest chapters, and we can choose a few things. We can choose to try and get past this. We can choose to put a force out there and stop things from happening. We can hope that in the midst of COVID-19 or something else, it passes by and we don't have to turn that mirror to look at the harsh reality of those underlying gaps, whether it be healthcare disparities, whether it be educational disparities in our communities of color, whether it be policing disparities in our community of color, whether it be wealth acquisition in our communities of color, are all very real. We pride ourselves on a state of openness. We pride ourselves on a state of being friendly. I've talked a lot about One Minnesota. That wasn't on display last night. I don't naively think everything heals and you come to the forefront and you say it'll be better. This is a community that demands and should expect more than words. They should expect results. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan and I have tried to make equity the center of everything we've done. But obviously in Minneapolis on Monday night, there wasn't a lot of equity for George Floyd. His family is probably wondering where the One Minnesota is for them. And that's on us as Minnesotans, us as the governor and the team that works with me to put the things in order to establish order in our streets, to establish and rebuild trust in our communities, to lift those voices up to be heard, not pleading for their lives, but demanding the changes necessary so no one else is put into that position. So I would like at this time to turn it over to Minnesota's Attorney General, Keith Ellison.
Governor, thank you. Martin Luther King said many years ago that riot is the way that the unheard get heard. He didn't condone it, but he said to the nation, as a person who always protested peacefully, that don't just dismiss that and ignore it and relegate it to just criminality and bad behavior. Actually ask yourself, what's going on there? And is it something that we as a society absolutely must pay attention to? I think we must pay attention to it. I'd like everyone to recognize the fact that the National Guard just a week ago was administering COVID-19 tests to help people, The presence you see on the street, don't react to them the way you might react to the Minneapolis Police Department. It's not the same group. They have different leadership, different authority, and their job is to try to bring peace and calm back again. Please remember that this is not the group that you associate with unfair conduct, but it's a group that, in fact, just a week ago was trying to make sure that Minnesotans could survive and thrive and live, because we are still in the middle of a pandemic. It is that sense of service where they get involved when it comes to natural disasters, storms, floods, rains, diseases. Now they have to restore order on the streets. And I hope that the community who is protesting will protest peacefully, but not see this as another occupation by another military force. It really is to make sure that there's calm and peace and that everybody can operate peacefully. So please accept it as that. I'm asking that of our community. It is essential, and I've said this before, everybody keeps asking the question, when? And this is a perfectly legitimate question. It is important to know that under Minnesota statutes, the primary jurisdiction for criminal prosecution is with the county attorney in which the offense occurred. And I believe that the message has been sent and received that the wheels of justice must turn swiftly. Not unjustly, expeditiously, thoroughly, fairly, but swiftly. It is important that people have confidence that accountability, no matter who you may be, is how we live in Minnesota. Let me also say that this prosecution, this investigation, this criminal process is important, and it is, and the whole country and the whole world's looking at it, cannot solve the problem. As the governor so eloquently said, events like this start and they come to a conclusion, but we never start the process of real reform. I will submit to you that myself and Commissioner Harrington, under the leadership of the governor, have already started a process on the working group on preventing and reducing deadly force encounters with the police. We have a report that we want attention from the legislature and the entire community on, to focus on that so that we can really get to the bottom of this when it comes to issues of use of force, when it comes to officer wellness, when it comes to community healing, and a whole range training issues, all kinds of things that bear on this issue. And it's not just those things. I believe that the real work of our working group is the implementation of this, and that really begins in earnest now and is more important now, I think, than ever. So I just want to, as I conclude my remarks, I want to say that we have to have a situation where Lake Street, a precious jewel of our state, is a place where Minnesotans can walk again, where businesses can be safe again. But I want to be clear that if the message was this situation with Mr. Floyd is intolerable, absolutely unacceptable, and must change, that message has been sent and received as well. And the governor, myself, the lieutenant governor, all of us are committed to that long-term change. And I can tell you that I spoke with many legislators who feel the exact same way. People in the philanthropic community feel the exact same way. So I think we're going to do some real changing. We're not just going to fix the windows and sweep up the glass. We're going to fix the broken, shattered society that leaves so many people behind based on their historical legacy of being in bondage and servitude, then second-class citizenship, and now fraught with disparities from everything from incarceration to housing to wages to everything else. And so with that, I want to hand it over to General Jensen, Major General Jensen, who will further elaborate. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Major General John Jensen. I'm the Adjutant General of the Minnesota Army National Guard, and I've been the Adjutant General since November of 2017. And what I'm going to describe this morning very quickly is the actions of the Minnesota National Guard since we were mobilized under the Governor Walz's executive order. Like many Minnesotans, I woke up yesterday morning to the news that the Minneapolis mayor had requested National Guard support. The only difference was I opened up my phone and there was a text from Commissioner Harrington. It wasn't the newspaper or the morning news that notified me of that. So immediately yesterday morning, I made contact with the commissioner, and we began planning on the potential employment of the Minnesota National Guard in support of Minneapolis. For those of you that may not understand how emergency management works in Minnesota, I'm just going to take a quick moment and explain that. In Minnesota, county emergency management coordinators or the mayors of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, and Duluth may request National Guard support through the state EOC. So in accordance with that, Minneapolis Mayor Frey made that request of the Minnesota National Guard. What traditionally comes with a request, though, is a layout of capability needed and exactly the problem that's trying to be solved. Typically, the request for the Guard and that type of information come at the same time. Sometimes it lags. So when it lags, what we do is we begin preparing for an unknown mission. But in this case, we sort of knew what we might be doing as it related to civil disturbance in Minneapolis. But it's very important that we know exactly what we're being asked to do, so we make sure that we have the right equipment. We mobilize the right number of soldiers and the right number of soldiers and airmen to support those soldiers that are going to conduct the mission. That element was lacking. But with the governor's decision to allow me to continue to plan, we began notifying soldiers early yesterday morning of a pending mission. Once we notified our soldiers, again with the governor's verbal approval, we began mustering our soldiers and moving them into the metro area, knowing that the most likely probability of employment was going to be Minneapolis. As we met as a senior team yesterday afternoon, the one topic that continued to be discussed was the lack of clarity and the lack of a mission and a description of what exactly the Minnesota National Guard needed to do. My concern to the governor was twofold. One, I didn't know what special equipment I might need to accomplish the mission. And two, I was very concerned about being asked to move to an unfamiliar area of Minneapolis under the cover of darkness. I wanted to get out when it was still daylight, where my soldiers and my airmen could become familiar with their terrain and familiar with their mission. We never got such mission assignment. We never got such mission description. Yesterday, we performed 4 missions in support of the governor's executive order. The first mission came from the governor directly. That came when we were notified of an immediate and pending threat to the state capitol. My immediate advice to the governor was to assign that mission to the Minnesota National Guard. And he agreed, with one caveat, and that is the State Patrol also wanted to support that mission. So in cooperation with the State Patrol, we began that mission. The second and third mission came together. It came from St. Paul. Specifically, it was to provide security of the Ramsey County Law Enforcement Center and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. The key part of that security was to ensure that St. Paul police officers were not required to secure those facilities, and they were therefore relieved of that duty and able to respond throughout the city of St. Paul throughout the day. And then the last mission we did receive yesterday evening was an escort mission for the Minneapolis Fire Department. The concept of the operation is that we would link up with the Minneapolis Police Department, and as they went into unsecure and dangerous areas, that we would secure the area so they could perform their life-saving and property-saving missions. And we continued to do those missions through the evening. As the governor indicated, about midnight this morning, the governor authorized a law and order mission into the 3rd precinct, what we would call in the military a clear and security mission. So under the leadership of the State Patrol and the Department of Public Safety, the Minnesota National Guard was assigned a task and a mission in support of the State Patrol. We would follow the State Patrol, and we would help secure the area that they cleared. Our soldiers remain in that area as I speak now, still on that mission, still securing that location. So people and MnDOT can come in and begin the cleanup of that area. Now, we also have picked up one other mission with the city of Minneapolis. I won't cover the exact details, but it's ongoing right now with the Minneapolis Police Department. And I'm very proud of the relationship between the Minnesota National Guard and the Minneapolis Police Department that goes back to Super Bowl 52 just 2 years ago. Chief Rondo and I worked together during that Super Bowl. So we have had opportunities to serve together, and I have a lot of respect for him. We will continue to operate in Minneapolis until such time that the governor relieves us of that mission. And we will do so in support of the Department of Public Safety and the Minnesota State Patrol. So that's just a little bit of background of what the Minnesota National Guard did since yesterday morning when we first notified of a possible deployment, through the deployment and through our mission set last night and then early this morning. My recommendation this morning to the governor was that I continue to do the state capitol mission and that I continue to do the mission in support of the Minneapolis Fire Department. I believe both of those are very critical mission, both to the state and to Minneapolis. And then we'll conduct follow-on missions, again, in support of the Minnesota State Patrol and the Department of Public Safety. So at this time, I'd like to introduce the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, Commissioner John Harrington.
Good morning. My name is John Harrington. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety. Governor Walz tasked me to prepare options and capacities and capabilities to respond to the civil unrest, protests, but more importantly, and really more directly, to the unlawful behavior of the arsonists, the thieves, the burglars, the vandals who were tearing apart the city of Minneapolis. I want that to be clear that that's, I think, a clear line of demarcation that we were operating under, because it is fundamental to the Department of Public Safety, it is fundamental to the State Patrol that we take an oath to support the Constitution and that we believe that our work is absolutely essential to allow everyone's First Amendment right to have their voices heard. We were not deployed, and we have not been deployed, and we will not be deployed to stifle free speech. But we will not and cannot allow unlawful, dangerous behavior to continue. I am particularly proud of our relationship with both the Minnesota National Guard, Commissioner Stroman from the Department of Natural Resources, and Colonel Langer, who works for the Department of Public Safety as the colonel for the Minnesota State Patrol. We called and they came. And literally it was that, it doesn't make it much more complicated than that. I said, I'm going to need you, and I'm going to need you here in the city, and I may need you for 2 or 3 days, and I may need you longer than that, and I can't tell you what I'm going to need you to do yet, but I know I need you. And they came. They began preparing readiness to be able to move folks from all over the state of Minnesota, literally from miles and miles away, to come to the metro area to be prepared to help us keep the peace. Over the course of the day, I met with my counterparts in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Chief Arredondo and Chief Axtell, to talk about what missions they needed the state to help them fulfill. The Department of Public Safety at that point was calling to say, we are here to support you. We are your partners. Tell us what you need and we will backfill, we will fill in the gaps. Tell us what you need for resources and we will help you get it. And we did get some very specific missions, and in other cases, we got no real mission at all. And in the absence of a real mission, we began to identify where the critical needs were. We tasked the State Patrol, we tasked DNR, we tasked the Minnesota National Guard to meet specific missions that we were requested to do. But we also tasked them with being flexible, because we knew that if things continued to devolve, that we might need to pivot and we might need to shift from a static post of guarding critical infrastructure to a fast-moving operational approach of restoring order. About midnight last night, I was party to a call where that pivot had to be made, where the mayor of Minneapolis called and said they had no more resources and they were not able to meet the public safety needs and control the behaviors that were occurring on Lake Street. They had lost the 3rd precinct. There was concerns about a gas main, and there was concerns about continued looting and fires burning throughout the city of Minneapolis. And different than our first night, I had comparable concerns of looting and fires being set in the city of St. Paul, and so we had to divide our resources to meet the needs of both of the Twin Cities. The task the governor gave me was pretty simple, actually. It was to pull together a team that could go in, keep the peace, protect people, protect them, protect their safety, protect their lives, protect their liberty, and to protect property that was being burned up literally every minute that we delayed. The Hennepin County Sheriff was one of my first calls, and Sheriff Hutchinson immediately moved into action to give us support. We already had DNR, we already had State Patrol, we already had Minnesota National Guard. We had it available, but we hadn't tasked them with what we needed to do yet, and we had to create a plan. The U of M Police Chief, Matt Clark, offered support. Eddie Frizzell, the Chief of Police for Metro Transit, offered support. And with that team together, we put together a 250 ballpark cadre team to go in and restore order on Lake Street. We created a mission. It was very specific. I am a mission-driven person. We talked about the fact that we were going to be respectful of people's rights, that we were going to keep the peace and make people safe, and that we were going to follow our training and protocols by making a public announcement that they needed to clear the streets, and that if they didn't clear the streets, arrests were imminent. We made those announcements. We made those announcements repeatedly so that no one would be confused about what our intent was or what we were there to do. And then, having made our announcements, we began to move to clear those streets. I will tell you that the vast majority of the great people of Minnesota and the great people of Minneapolis who are still having their guts ripped out about the Lloyd murder, and we'll call it a murder, that's what it looked like to me. I don't want to prejudice this from a criminal perspective, but I'm just calling it what I see at that point. They weren't the people that were out there on the streets at 3 o'clock in the morning when we arrived on Lake Street. The people that were out there on Lake Street at 3 o'clock in the morning weren't the good people of Minnesota. They weren't the good people of Minneapolis. They weren't the people that wanted to mourn the lossing of a friend and a relative and a neighbor. And when they saw the National Guard, Minnesota State Patrol, and this cadre, this team moving down the street, the vast majority of them did what we thought they would do. They left. There were a few that decided not to leave. That was a choice that they get to make, but we had advised them what that choice would result in. And we took action to respectfully and carefully take folks into custody as was necessary. And it was a very limited and very structured and extremely disciplined approach to making those arrests. I'm very proud of the fact that despite what you've seen over the last few days of gas and canisters and foggers, almost no chemical agent was necessary to be used last night. We did it the old-fashioned way. Command presence, a uniform presence, and a clear intent to keep the peace, restore order, and to keep people safe. My task today is a little different. Having accomplished that mission, and I think we've secured those streets. And I appreciate the fact that I've right now got National Guard folks still holding that ground that we took last night. We need to keep that ground, and we need to prepare for what may come today. Our task today is we're bringing together a unified command of metro area police departments, sheriff's departments, and other law enforcement jurisdictions and other public safety entities into a multi-agency command center where we will create a plan that will keep the peace, maintain the peace, and prevent further lawless behavior in the city of Minneapolis, in the city of St. Paul, and in the surrounding suburbs. We're going to do this the right way. We're going to do it with full knowledge that our oath is to serve the state of Minnesota, to serve the communities, and to protect them. We are fully confident that we can do that mission and that we can do it while still ensuring that the constitutional rights of those who need to have their voices heard and who need to freely assemble can be protected. I can tell you that no one could have heard Mr. Lloyd's voice in the chaos of the screaming and the shouting and the fires at 1 o'clock in the morning on Lake Street. My job is to make sure that tonight that the community is safe and that our team is ready and prepared to keep it safe. With that, I am very pleased to introduce the Colonel of the Minnesota State Patrol, Colonel Matt Langer.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. My name is Matt Langer, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as Chief of the Minnesota State Patrol. I don't need to rehash what the Commissioner went through in terms of the detail that he provided on the role of the Minnesota State Patrol as it pertains to the city of Minneapolis this week. I was thinking about what to say about this week, and difficult is the first word that comes to mind, and it doesn't seem to represent everything that has occurred this week well enough, but it certainly represents the challenges that the Minnesota State Patrol has faced the last couple of nights as we have worked hard to combat the lawlessness, the dangerous behavior, and the criminal activity that has occurred both in the city of Minneapolis and other places. I'll speak specifically to last night because, as you've heard, shortly after midnight, between midnight and 1 a.m., Governor Walz asked the State Patrol to lead an event in the city of Minneapolis to quell the unrest that was occurring in and around the 3rd Precinct. There were many challenges in that area. One of the main challenges in that area was that there were fires set, and the Minneapolis Fire Department was unable to get there and extinguish those fires because they were shelled by those that were demonstrating and choosing to make life difficult for everyone who was trying to improve the condition. So as the Commissioner explained, we assembled a team, both with the State Patrol, the DNR, the University of Minnesota, Transit PD, Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, and the National Guard, and we assembled that team quickly, swiftly, strategically, and we descended into the city of Minneapolis with the one goal in mind: to, as safely and quickly as possible, recover the ground that had been lost to lawless activity and make it safe again, and then restore order, clean the area, and get it presentable so that we can move into the future tonight and beyond with a much different picture of what it means to be a resident citizen and your ability to demonstrate peacefully. That's the mission that we took on. That's what we did overnight. It was difficult, dangerous work for everyone involved, the people that are demonstrating, those that are caught in the middle of a demonstration without the desire to demonstrate, and the first responders that are there trying to do good work. We had a few troopers that suffered minor injuries. I'm thankful they're only minor. They stayed on the line and continued their good work because we needed every single one of them to do this job. We remain ready. We're there today with the National Guard. We're doing our best to hold that ground well and to make sure that we restore order, clean that spot up to the better than it was before, and to continue our efforts to make sure that public safety is of paramount concern as we move forward both tonight and into the future, and then work together to restore order across the entire city of Minneapolis. Just as a side note, we had a couple missions other places last night. Of course, our responsibility at the state capitol, And we also assisted the city of St. Paul with some lawless behavior that was occurring on University Avenue with some of our mobile response team assets. One thing I'll note is that we have troopers in the metropolitan area from all across the state of Minnesota. That was an opportunity that we afforded the governor to make a staffing boost that is within the purview of the executive branch and within the ability of the State Patrol to do on very short notice. My hat's off to those troopers that responded, those DNR officers that responded from all across the state of Minnesota to come for an unknown period of time and to work very, very hard to make Minnesota what we believe it should be, a safe place for everybody. Thank you.
I would note before we take questions, and we will try and make sure we answer every one or as many as you need to ask, I would note to the reporters here in Minnesota, it was about 3 weeks ago I stood in front of you and as we passed 500 deaths by COVID-19 and said that on about the 29th of May we would pass 1,000. That will happen today. So in the midst of this pandemic, we are still working that. We believe, again, numbers are down. ICU bed capacity is stable, and we are doing everything we can. And as you heard from the folks speaking, the vast majority of people out there who were expressing their First Amendment rights and the rage over what happened to George Floyd were wearing masks, and we're trying their best to social distance and not touch things. I would, before I go to questions, note that the desire to get back to normal is so overwhelming for everyone. When so many in Minnesota would said, what else could happen? We've witnessed this, but I think it's an important time to pause about that is, the problem is for so many of us thinking that normal is where we want to go. Normal was not working for many communities. Normal was not working for George Floyd pre-COVID-19. It's certainly not working now. And so I think as you heard the Attorney General talk about that work that we're trying to look at to use this as a point and not just rhetorically, but a point to make those changes. With that, Mary, we'll start. Well, I certainly don't think it's important to be on TV. I think what you expected me to do is to be there is we were in a support role as state law shows. And once it became apparent to me that the city of Minneapolis would not be able to complete that, I was directing the state to take that over. This is my responsibility. Well, I think obviously if you think I didn't, that's probably the case as a reporter. But I think in the moment of making sure as those decisions were being made and that we were staying in the lane that we were asked to support this, and as it deteriorated, it was at 12:05. There was a decision last night that we made is to come in front of you at that time because that was the transition point, because what you're seeing now is the state is the lead element now, starting at 12:05 last night and those first missions that were carried out. So I think for many of you who know, I try and make myself as available as possible. I think it was important for me to be getting the data and the feedback. I was watching where you were seeing, and to be quite candid, when the third precinct was abandoned, it seemed at that point in time that was a time to move. So, no, I stayed in the residences where I work from. I have all the electronic tools, and we were on all night. And as I said, we were taking calls and adjusting, and I was able to track as the situation evolved on going down. There was a dangerous task that I tasked the State Patrol and the National Guard to go down and take that. Those of you who were watching that as I was, as the lawlessness was burning down the third precinct or whatever, that can't be allowed to happen. It took a little while to plan this to get going, but that's where I was at to make sure it was executed. Tom?
There are millions of Americans in Minnesota certainly watching on their TV screens as this unfolded last night. There was almost a capability of local police, state police, National Guard, to much fanfare about how the National Guard will watch buildings burn. How could there not have been a mission for the National Guard in this when they were called in, we knew things were going to happen?
Yeah, I will let my leadership come back up there. You're absolutely right, and I think that speaks to itself that by shortly after 10 o'clock, it became apparent that that structure would go. The way this works is the mayors ask and they take charge and lead on the missions. I'll let the folks come up here said, I see that too. I think the decision to not engage, and I want to just be clear, there's philosophically an argument to be made that an armed presence on the ground in the midst of where we just had a police killing is seen as a catalyst. My point to that is we don't need a catalyst. It's already burning. And so this is trying to strike that balance. And so I am in total agreement with that. You will not see that tonight. There will be no lack of leadership, and there will be no lack of response on the table.
So a follow-up, should there have been a National Guard presence on every corner in those areas last night as a deterrent, as opposed to having them come in?
Well, I would ask, and I'll answer this one, potentially, but the decision on that, as it's made from the city, and on this one, I think I would agree with them. We saw the first night, decisions were made. Up until about 8:30 last evening, it appeared that things were relatively peaceful on that. There was a decision during the day whether did you occupy the entire city and shut it down after those 24 hours. In retrospect, I'm assuming that, yes, we would say that. But at the time, and again, we will not know it as proving the negative, would it have simply started those that movement faster, and would we have seen it moved out of the 3rd precinct? But yes, certainly, it's a valid critique and point. Yes.
So there was uncontrolled looting in St. Paul yesterday afternoon, and you're talking about making decisions at 10 o'clock. Why are you making the decisions then and not coming up with these scenarios and these things that are happening?
The leadership of communities is led by local leadership, their police force. They were at that time, had sources in reserve, they were not being requested. They were not being requested, and I'm on with them. The reason we're standing here today is, if this would have been executed correctly, the state would not lead on this. The state would have supported those, and they would have moved forward. That did not happen. So now today, we're taking that. We're making the decision to go and moving forward. And again, I would go back to Tom's question. Had I known that we were not going to see that or the capability to do it, should the state have come in? Potentially, but I want to be very clear. This, with the exception of the state troopers who have a very specific statutory requirement on the highways, order is to the local police and sheriffs. We do not have a built-in police force. General Jensen is not a police force. DPS has experts in there, but these are not the police force that are on their streets with their people. And so that's a decision that was made. It was in reserve. And yes, keeping in mind as this unfolded, the request came from St. Paul for the Guard to be activated at 5. I had moved on a warning order earlier than that to be prepared. You're really supposed to wait until you get that and start moving them in. That wasn't going to be possible. So by 5 o'clock yesterday, our Guard troops were coming from all over. They were getting activated because of the events that happened the night before, and we were prepared to carry out those missions. And they were there. And as you heard some of these folks, those missions never came.
Mr. Walz, some of the things you're saying about a lack of clarity on a mission or a lack of mission is pretty extraordinary. That's supposed to come from your side.
I'll let our folks talk. Yes.
Yeah, again, as it relates to emergency management in Minnesota, county emergency management coordinators do exactly what you just asked. They define what they need and what they want. And then that's negotiated with the state EOC and the Department of Public Safety, along with the agency they're asking for. It's not always the National Guard. In this case, it is the National Guard. The reason why it's negotiated with the National Guard is to make sure that we have the capability to do the mission that's being asked. So yes, we are always in support of the local leadership, the local civilian leadership. I have no authority to self-deploy the Minnesota National Guard anywhere in the state. I have no authority whatsoever. And so I follow exactly what you laid out. Civilian leadership, civilian elected officials make the request, and then we work with them. Because if I'm not accomplishing their task and their mission, I risk failure of mission. I also risk the chance that I might break the law, right? I can't just march my soldiers down into Minneapolis and say, hey, this is what John Jensen believes we need to do. That's not how our government works, and that's not how our military responds and reports to legitimate civilian leadership. And so what you asked is exactly right. That's exactly how it's supposed to work.
Follow-up for Governor Walz. We told in the morning by Mayor Fry that the plan was to let the protesters take over the third precinct. And if that's true, why did it take until 10:30 for that to happen? And then why were you not called until after midnight to take over?
I think that's a question you'll have to ask Mayor Fry.
And it's true that you were told in the morning.
I think that the commitment to hold the third was not one that I felt comfortable with, and it's one we discussed during the day.
But you were told
So,
really early.
that the potential that the third precinct would not be held, that's correct.
Up on
Well, obviously, that was the turning point where we were prepared, and that's where we moved in. That's where we did not believe that the 3rd should be given up, and that's why it's not, and that area was taken back by the force that we put together starting at 12:15, executed about 3:40 a.m. I simply think that I'm like all of you watching it, you can't have civil order deteriorate, and then you have to make a calculated decision about, does force going in there escalate it? Does it stop it? Does it endanger civilians and the force going in there? And those are decisions, as you heard again, it is local police departments is how this works. We are not a police force, the state. We have abilities to come back and backfill. The closest we have to that police force is the State Patrol, but that's not their normal. Yeah, from 8:30 to 10, that was the decision to go, and it took time to build the force to be able to go, too. Because, again, we're seeing it, and there was no definitive answer whether they were going to, and I'm seeing what you were seeing. There were still officers in the 3rd precinct, at least, I believe, until, maybe you can correct me on this, till 9 o'clock or so, maybe 10. Certainly all those tools are there, and I think what we'll do is that's what's the planning stage right now. I don't want to take these folks too long from what they're doing. That's what's being done over the last 24 hours as we prepare for this. But once again, the order structure of this, and many of us have been involved with these. I spent 24 years in the National Guard myself. I'm very familiar of how these works. I'm very familiar with what General Jensen's asking about. When my troops get their mission, they get their mission order, they get a warning order, they know what they're going to need to do. I then, as an enlisted soldier, would start working with my troops to make sure they were packing the proper equipment, check it out, be ready to go, drill through the things we needed to do. Those never came in many cases. So. Well, we are. And again, I think if we'd have seen 2 days ago, yeah, maybe yesterday, I'll be the first to tell you that. I think in any of these things, if you're not second guessing and if you're not looking at the decisions were made, you're going about this all wrong. I think the lessons learned, potentially so. But again, at that time, we've got to count on our partners in this as they say things are going. And I'm not sure that quick-moving group of anarchists that was moving so quickly. One of the things we said, if you think about this, to prevent this from happening, like at the Super Bowl or the RNC, 18 months of planning went into that. 18 months of planning and pre-positioning, 18 months of joint powers agreements, 18 months of lining up the materials that were there to make sure all those situations could be there. Because my situation on this is once you lose control like that, I'm deeply concerned that the bad actors, and I want to be very clear, we own this. We own this in Minnesota. But there certainly, as people saw this unfold, the concern was yesterday how many people would make their way here who are simply in that business. So, yeah, I think it's a valid question. I think for me, as I look at that, the point is I have to operate in real space and in real time. And by last evening was the second day we saw it. And from 8:30 or during the day until 8:30, we did see this in St. Paul. We continued to ask what was happening in St. Paul. The State Patrol was tasked on many of this, and they did stop a lot of that along the Target and some of those. That was what was being asked from them. But it happened from about 8:30 at night when the sun went down, when what I saw was the person breaching the barrier at the 3rd, and then the decision to pull back out of there. So who hasn't asked? I got to make sure I get to everybody. Dave, in the back.
Governor, so it sounds like you are going to allow demonstrations tonight, protests and stuff. You would be in violation.
No, we're not allowing any of those, and we've said it. I think the idea, again, the absurdity in the middle of COVID-19, where we have worked so dang hard as a state to keep people from congregating, if you think you could, but it goes back to this conversation we've had in Minnesota. This takes a social compact of people agreeing to do this. And I want to just say this. Watching what happened to George Floyd had people say, to hell with staying home on that. I'm going out because this can't happen again. The idea that we would go in there and break up those peaceful expressions of grief and rage was ridiculous. The problem was of not having in place with an expectation that a crowd that big over such a volatile issue. We have seen this happen in city after city, whether it was Ferguson, whether it was LA. We've seen these things. That was the thing why we started planning, started asking. But again, you're seeing holes in planning That's for darn sure as states and cities and counties on these things start to happen. Let Dave finish up.
What's the rules for the rest of the day and tonight?
That's what's being worked on right now. And we certainly, this is the plan that will be presented to me. I think we want to be prepared to present that to Minnesotans here by 2 o'clock or so. What I can tell you is a lot of it is going to be the operational things that you would expect to happen that were asked. They will be there. There will be a presence out on the corners. We will start to do that. But I'm going to ask again. I need to ask Minnesotans, those in pain and those who feel like justice has not been served yet, you need to help us create this space so that that justice will be served. And it's my expectation that it'll be swift and that we're able to maintain that order. And so that plan will start to happen today, and it will include, we will think of all the tools that are there. I want to come back to that again. The more of those things you use, the more those are viewed as the oppressive things that led to much of this in the first place. What we're trying to separate is the lawful First Amendment aggrieved citizens who need to express that from the folks who are clearly, I'm telling you what, the farthest thing from people's on their minds is they're burning down a family-owned store at 3 a.m. on Lake Street was George Floyd. And that's what we've got to get at. Let me go up front, Theo. I am candidly, I don't think this is a secret to anybody that the tension between the Minneapolis Police Department and many of their communities is a pretty well-known thing. And I am certainly, I don't know any way to express it other than that they had lost faith in them and felt that they were part of the problems. And certainly seeing a uniformed Minneapolis police officer's knee on George Floyd's neck on Monday pretty much tells you where the public is thinking towards that. So I don't think you could think it was a mistake of who was leading that down there and that it changed the tone that was there. So I am concerned. I think it would be disingenuous. I know this is painful. This is hard. There is going to be recriminations. There's going to be going back and looking at this, as there should be. My top priority now is the immediate security to make sure that what happened the last 48 hours does not happen tonight. The state of Minnesota has assumed that responsibility. I don't think it's going to be easy, because this whole whack-a-mole thing, and these folks are really good at what they were trying to do on causing destruction. The way we're able to stop it is employ these tools with the support of the public to make sure we isolate these folks. And again, as Commissioner Harrington said, the idea that you think you can firebomb a building and not be arrested and spend serious time in jail, I understand that. But the idea that we don't want to make people who are out there still asking, what about George Floyd? What happened to those people? What happened to the people who did this? That got lost in 48 hours of anarchy. That's what we're going to put again. Tom.
We saw television on live television. You or anyone out there tell me how many looters and been arrested for the past 2 days?
I don't know. I'm going to use this as an opportunity again. As I said, Tom, I am deeply apologetic that this happened. I understand that the community would believe if this were targeted. As I told Jeff Zucker, the president of CNN, I don't care at this point what the circumstance was, why they got arrested. It is wrong. It is unacceptable, and we needed to correct it. As far as others, who can answer? Yeah, how many?
Anybody been charged or arrested?
Yes, both St. Paul and State Patrol and others have made arrests on burglary, arson charges, I believe arson charges. I know burglary for sure, that they have been arrested. There has been stops. There has been, in fact, folks incarcerated. I do not know if they've been charged yet or not, because I think most of them were done in the last 24 hours.
Burglary, is that looting?
Yes, it's breaking into the grocery stores, breaking into the Targets, breaking into the Walgreens. The pharmacies have been just decimated with folks we believe who are seeking Oxycontin and other opioids out of the pharmacy stock. And so we've been chasing that around, as well as chasing the folks that have been setting fires. So yes, there have been arrests made, and there will be more arrests made. Say again?
Give us any idea of a number?
I will get you a number. I don't have that. I'd asked both Minneapolis, St. Paul, and my other folks that were part of our unified command to get me information by 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock this morning. I have not received it yet. But I'm hopeful to have a sit rep from the last 24 hours, and we'll get that to you as soon as I get it.
I have to ask you your reaction to President Trump's piece from last night in relation to Minnesota and what he said.
Well, it's not helpful. I did speak to the president last evening. At that point in time, it was in the process of where I said we were going to assume control of this, that it was unnecessary. I did not know he was going to tweet. He certainly can. It's just not helpful. It's not helpful. The city of Minneapolis is doing everything they can. If mistakes are made and there's an accountability, we need to do that. But in the moment where we're at, in a moment that is so volatile, anything we do to add fuel to that fire is really, really challenging. So as I said, I spoke to the president. He pledged his support of anything we need in terms of supplies to get to us. There's a way to do this without inflaming. And again, this one is so difficult. As I said again, the tools of restoring order are viewed by so many as the things that have oppressed and started this problem in the first place. So it would just be more helpful at this point in time. We may, if we need support from them, it's certainly appropriate that we will ask. But at this point in time, I'm confident that the plan we put together today to restore this order. So, Brian. Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe this is Commissioner Harrington and Attorney General Ellison. When we first came into office last year, this was one of the things we wanted. And I said this, as a governor, the nightmare scenario of having a police-involved shooting, or as any elected official, is one. So they started working this. I think I'll hear from Attorney General.
Well, Governor, thank you. I think this really is the time to start talking about how we do meaningful, deep dive reform. We took a year to grab in a number of people from diverse interests in the community. We had people from the community, from the civil rights community. We had law enforcement there. We had law enforcement from across the state. We met for about a year. We had a professional assistance from the group that guided the 21st century policing process that President Obama started. And we came up with a number of key recommendations. We will get that report to you. We hope you write about it, but this supercharges the need for the effort. There was just a few recommendations, well, a few observations and a few recommendations. One observation is, a lot of the deadly force encounters that occur in our state are not concentrated in the Twin Cities. In fact, a majority of them were in greater Minnesota, although many were in the Twin Cities. Half of them were people in a mental health crisis. We talked about a number of things. We talked about officer wellness. Officers dealing from crisis to crisis to crisis need to be able to check in, get right before they go back and engage the public. We talked about changing and reviewing the standard, the use of force standard. We talked about making the sanctity of life an essential principle, which Mayor Hodges did when she was the mayor. We made the duty to intervene. We're recommending that be essential, meaning if you're a police officer, you see a fellow officer doing something wrong, you cannot just say, it's not me, you've got to do something about it. We came up with a number of other principles that I think are really helpful, very useful, involving training, reform at the post board, and a number of things. And I think that now there's a need to further the effort. I will say that I think that looking at systemic pattern and practice problems in Minneapolis Police Department is an appropriate conversation at this time. I think that we need to really do some deep diving and to make sure that our law enforcement professionals really do and really are serving the public, the whole public. So I will say that I hope that our state legislature takes up some of the initiatives that we have in there. The academic community will take up some of it. Training communities will take up some of it. I mean, one of the recommendations was a joint or dual response when there are chemical or mental health crises going on, so that it's not just officers that don't have the training on how to deal with somebody who's in that situation. That's a priority, and I'll hand it to Commissioner Harrington.
Attorney General Ellison covered really most of the points. The one other point that I will bring in is that this group was very much based out of community. We brought in folks from a variety of different diverse and geographic communities. We brought in folks from the disability community to make sure that all kinds of voices were heard. And one of the voices that I heard most clearly was the need for community healing and community health. And so one of the recommendations that we have put forward, we still think it was important before, but I've never seen it as acutely as important as it is right now, is for community healing. The question that we asked and that I ask here with you is, how does the community recover when its heart has been ripped out? That's... Sure. We are working with the county attorney, who is the charging authority, to make sure that we are following their guidance as we move forward in seeking the criminal prosecution.
Is there a more specific reason though that you can give? Because we've heard that in the last few days.
That is still the reason, and we're still in the middle of an ongoing investigation. And so I can't speak to much more than that, other than the past practice for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and most police departments has been, in these kind of cases, they work with the county attorney to make sure that they have checked all the I's and all the T's and made sure everything is in order before they make an arrest or before there's a charging decision. And we have been following that protocol with County Attorney Freeman in this case. We have history with County Attorney Freeman in terms of past cases, some successful, some not successful, depending on what your perspective is. So
There has to be some difference here, like there has to be discussion. This is different. Regarding everything that's going on, this is different than...
We are aware that there is certainly a sentiment that it's different, but from the point of view of the law, we have a man whose life has been ended. We have the pursuit of trying to find out what were the facts that are surround that, and to be able to create enough probable cause or enough basis for a criminal charge or for an arrest. That's pretty much Cop 101. That's what you have to have, and that's what we are working toward.
Yeah. Quick COVID-related questions here.
Sure.
The state spent hundreds of millions of dollars helping businesses with COVID. Are you ready to respond to the businesses in Minneapolis that are affected by this? And
Absolutely. There's, yeah.
And number two, we've been moving people out of detention because of COVID. If there are significant arrests, we have a place to put folks. It doesn't be out.
Well, yeah, I may need to listen to law enforcement on this one. These are great questions. It's ones that we came up with too, that what's going to happen. My hope is, and again, hope is not a plan. You need to execute that. But I think with Minnesotans understand what's at stake here and getting back to the focus of George Floyd and our community issues, that tonight needs to be different. And when I say that, it needs to be different in the questions you're asking. I'm stepping into that breach, and this is the responsibility. The state's responding. We'll use what we have. We'll use the tools. And so hopefully on that side, I'll ask John if he wants to on arrest.
Could you address the potential as well?
Sure. I think this is certainly something we still did not finish our work in the regular session. I think we're coming back on the 12th probably, and working with the legislature. I think there's a great desire to figure out how to do this. The tragedy of this, as I said again, is a community that felt this tragedy, a community that believes that they were that this has happened to, a community. When we say sometimes, I hear people sometimes say the system's broken. And I'll know communities of color will say, oh, no, the system's working just fine for certain people, not us. And I think for us right now, we need to take a really hard look about reinvesting, bringing Lake Street back, making sure. We're hoping that there is insurance for these folks, different things that we can do. But I think certainly getting our vitality back is one. Let me go to Theo. Oh, yeah, good. We'll come back.
So the first question, are they armed? Yes, they are currently armed. A little background on that. Yesterday afternoon, we received what I assessed as a credible threat specifically to the Minnesota National Guard. That credible threat was made available to us by the FBI. I shared that with Governor Walz, along with my recommendation that I felt as though it was a credible threat, and as a result, that we should arm the Minnesota National Guard. Governor Walz concurred with me and authorized me to arm the Minnesota National Guard. Now, what are the limits of their use of force? We traditionally don't talk about the use of force because it's an operational issue, but I will tell you this. Our guardsmen maintain the right to self-defense. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it as it relates to the use of force for the Minnesota National Guard. Thank you.
Governor, I think I heard General Langer talk about protecting the state capitol. Was he referring to the state capitol building? That building. As a follow-up, when will we make a decision on
Hopefully around 2 o'clock, Tom. I'll give you that so you know. Give us a little bit of time as they're finalizing on this, but I think that's one of the questions. Yes, and we had brought up the Capitol building before of that. These very symbolic targets that people had talked about, the folks who had, some of it was online. You saw the thing that came in. That's the one request that I made of the National Guard, and the mission that I'm asking for specifically on our troops that came in. Before the cities needed to ask for what they needed was the preservation of the Capitol and the Capitol grounds. And so that will still be in force.
They'll be guarding the building physically?
They are, and they have been. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Governor Walz, last time Mayor Carter made a claim that he believes the agitators are not from Minneapolis. Is there any evidence that? If so, who are these people and where are they coming from? Or do we believe that people that are burning down buildings?
Yeah, I certainly think, and I'm not going to speculate, we'd ask them. I think probably the assumption is there's folks that come in, but as I said earlier, we need to make sure that we own this. The thing that sparked this is a homegrown Minnesota thing. The event that sparked it.
You do think, though, that causing most of the bombs are not?
No, I don't know that. I think we can't tell that right now, but I think much of how a lot of this happened, certainly all of the things that have led to this is Minnesota, and I think we need to find out. I don't think it changes the calculus that much of how do we got to this, how do we respond to it.
It's not taking ownership of it, saying that the best of it is done by people around town.
Yeah, I'm taking ownership for it. It's ours. We own it.
Concerning the leadership, are you classifying the leadership of Mayor Carter in the same classification as the lack of leadership that you?
No, I'm not. No, and I didn't say Mayor Fry on this. I said my issues.
Using the passive voice, but talking about a lack of leadership.
Yeah.
Are we talking about Mayor Carter?
In the Minneapolis Police Department, and again like this, and I will assume responsibility if the issue is that the state should have moved faster. Yeah, that is on me, whether it's the forces that were underneath. So I don't think a lack of leadership. I think the lack of coordination and the lack of understanding what we needed to ask for. And again, that's in retrospect. I think that same criticism could be said to us, but the way things are lined up, that was their responsibility at that point. Now it's our responsibility to do that. And I think we've been in contact with the mayors. I think they are doing everything they possibly can in a situation that is unprecedented. I don't think, again, that's a cop-out of saying, oh, it's just unprecedented. That doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. But I think they're responding accordingly. I think we're learning a lot, as I said. These situations were planned for at the RNC in 18 months of planning and hundreds of millions of dollars. This came about after the killing of George Floyd on Monday night. It started to ramp up when the video came out on Tuesday. It accelerated into Wednesday and Thursday, and here we sat. I'll go back, Peter.
Typically, in a situation where you have actually witnessed a crime and you are immediately able to apprehend the suspect, it would be not unusual to have made an arrest, brought that person in, and then offered to the county attorney what you were able to cobble together in terms of information to seek a criminal charge. If there was no criminal charge because you did not have sufficient information, then the person is released pending further investigation. In this case, because there was a lag time between when the event occurred, when the video came out, and when BCA was then brought into this, there was not that same immediacy. And so a criminal investigation was initiated by the BCA very quickly, working in coordination with Amy Sweezy from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office to follow the protocols that County Attorney Freeman has outlined that he wants us to follow in terms of a officer-involved death case. So we are following the protocols that were established. We continue to follow those protocols. We continue to meet with the county attorney. We continue to meet with the FBI and with the U.S. attorney as we continue to seek justice and to seek what can we do and what are we allowed to do in bringing this case to a conclusion.
Question for General Jensen. Quick one. Do you have authority to arrest?
No, we do not have that authority. That's why typically in our missions we'll always have a law enforcement officer with us. So we have that support immediately available, but no, we don't.
Folks, we have time for one more question. Governor, you talked a lot about aspirations and plans this year. Are you standing here right now and assuring us that we're not going to see a repeat of the unrest last night, tonight, for the rest of the weekend?
I can't assure you, but the responsibility to ensure it doesn't happen falls upon me. And I will do everything in my power to do that. As I said, I spent myself 24 years in the National Guard. I'm surrounded by good people. We're pulling the assets in. I'm going to need the help of Minnesotans, like we do on a lot of this. I'm going to need folks to cooperate to get this through. I want to acknowledge again that pain that people are feeling, the need to get justice. I'm just going to respond to Peter's question too on this, Peter, because it was an excellent question, asking about the charges and things. For those of you who don't, I am not an attorney. I listen to them, and they're very concerned that the governor has to be very careful about what they say about prejudice in case. We want to make sure everybody gets justice, it gets done. But the questions that Minnesotans and the outrage they're feeling, I'm feeling them. It is taking all of my willpower to maintain that point of being asked. But the way I'm able to get them justice is by making sure that I put things in place that civil order is maintained, that we make it clear that there is an expectation that justice is moved forward. And as Attorney General Ellison says, this is a point in time that we cannot forget. Cannot forget George. We cannot forget the aftermath of this as if we would, but we have to get back to that point of what caused this all to happen and start working on that. So the anger and the frustration and the wondering why this is a community that year after year, decade after decade, and generation after generation hears this. So right now, I know there's a lot of folks out there listening that their answer should be, I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when justice is carried out. I'll believe it when equity actually means something. I'll believe it when the policies change. I'll believe it when my child gets the same education as your child and that color didn't matter. So I get it right now. We're asking an awful lot to be based on faith, and that has not panned out. But I do want to say, this is a state that I think we are coming to grips with the good that we have and that's not there, but it's always been about trying to strive to be better, trying to do more. I'm not trying to sugarcoat this. Just much like COVID-19, I've had to stand in front of you and tell you that it's going to get worse before it gets better. This is not going to be an easy journey. But the one thing that we have to ensure that civil order is maintained, so those changes we want to see. None of us can live in a society where roving bands go unchecked and do what they want to do, ruin property. And that the expectation is, where are the police? Where are the police? And this is the conundrum. Where are the police in the first place got us in this situation Monday night, and where are the police last night is it. And I heard from numerous people, I'm super nervous about the National Guard being brought in there. It's a flashpoint. This is a community. I understand that. I heard from some of those same people at 2 o'clock with a different tone. Where's the National Guard? Where is the National Guard? So over these next 24 to 48 hours, work with us to get the situation controlled. And I want to talk to those mayors who are up 24/7 in Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's not about calling out someone on lack of leadership. It's about an issue as it developed and all of us figuring out how we get there. This is volatile. This has been building for decades. This flashpoint came to us, and now what are we going to do about it? And it happened in the middle of an unprecedented global pandemic. So it gives us a chance. We're going to get to pick our paths very quickly here. How are we going to be seen by the world in the coming days? How are we going to be seen after that? How are we going to respond to one another? And then what are we going to do about it? And again, if I were everybody in these communities listening, I'd say, well, I'm going to believe it when I see it. So the first task at hand is get civil control back, get justice moving quickly and fairly, and start talking about together, how do we rebuild? How do we rebuild trust in the police? How do we rebuild those stores? How do we rebuild a society? How do we send that face to the world that sees us for so many positive things, but we need to recognize this is what they're seeing, and we need to take a hard look and figure out how do we change that. So I want to thank you all. Again, I'm going to close because of the importance I've said with the press. Deepest apologies to the reporters that were out there. Expectations that again, that cannot happen. We will do our best today, and I would ask all of you, as the ongoing mission to make sure that we have peace and security today is making sure that that story is told. I'm asking our team to make sure that press credentials, the ability to move you and protect you safely needs to be out there, so this is covered. Please let us know quickly on that. Please make sure that that's happening. Please show the world everything that's happening here through that lens of professional journalists who ask the questions you're asking today. So thank you all.
We just heard from Governor Tim Walz and other Minnesota state leaders in response to last night's violence in the Twin Cities, including Attorney General Keith Ellison, the Department of Public Safety Commissioner, and the Major General from the Minnesota National Guard and Minnesota State Patrol Colonel. They recapped and talked about what a difficult week this has been for Minnesota, especially the unrest there in Minneapolis. Minneapolis has issued a state of emergency in response to a question for the governor about why it took so long to respond to the violence going on there last night. He said it was up to local police authorities to have a mission for the National Guard, and they did mention that they failed to do that, so it wasn't until around midnight that the Minnesota governor took control of that. He said there will not be a repeat tonight. Around 2 p.m. it is expected that they will decide if a curfew needs to be in place for the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. They are, of course, asking people to step up now and help clean up those businesses that were ransacked, destroyed by the fires, clean up the streets, and come together as a community. He said we have to restore order before we start addressing those issues. Of course, there is so much more to come, and protests here have come here to the Northland as well, and really across the nation. We have seen those, including in New York City, protesters defying New York's coronavirus prohibition on public gatherings, demonstrators there blocking traffic, also in downtown Denver, Columbus, Ohio, coast to coast. President Donald Trump also getting in on this, threatening to take action and bring the city of Minneapolis under control, calling the violent protesters thugs. The Minnesota governor saying this wasn't helpful. He tweeted that Friday this morning, and then saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts, drawing criticism there. We will, of course, continue to track all of our developments and updates this afternoon, continuing to bring you the latest on WDIO.com, our mobile app, and tonight starting at 5 on WDIO News.
This has been a WDIO News Special Report.